My name is Dylan Barrett, and this happened to me on September 3rd, 1997. I've been a truck driver for nearly 22 years, hauling goods up and down the East Coast. Most of the time, it's a straightforward job: drive, deliver, repeat. But every so often, something out of the ordinary happens. This time, it wasn't just out of the ordinary, it was a nightmare. It started like any other day. I picked up a load in Albany, New York, bound for a small town in rural Pennsylvania. The route took me through some pretty isolated areas, places where cell service was a joke, and the nearest help might be hours away. Not that I minded it, I've always enjoyed the solitude. It gives me time to think. I was cruising down a 2-lane highway, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional farmhouse. It was early afternoon, the sky overcast, the kind of weather that makes everything look a little more dreary. I was making good time, planning to stop at a diner I knew about an hour down the road for a late lunch. I had just rounded a bend when I saw a car on the shoulder, its hood up. A woman was standing beside it, waving her arms. I pulled over more out of habit than anything. Truckers help each other out. It's just what we do. I climbed down from the cab and walked over. She was in her late 30s, maybe, with short brown hair and a look of genuine relief on her face. "Thank God you stopped," she said. "My car just died and I don't have any cell service." "Let me take a look," I said. "I'm no mechanic, but I know my way around an engine." I fiddled with the battery cables, checked the oil, tried to start it up. Nothing. "It's dead," I said. "I can give you a lift to the next town, though. It's about 30 miles up the road." She hesitated for a second, then nodded. "That would be great. I really appreciate it." We climbed into the cab, and she introduced herself as Lisa. We made small talk as we drove, the kind of idle chatter you make with strangers. She was a teacher on her way to visit her sister. Nice enough lady, seemed genuinely grateful for the ride. About 15 minutes down the road, we passed a little dirt pull-off. Nothing special about it, just a place where the road widened a bit. But as we went by, something caught my eye. It was quick, just a flash of movement in the trees. I didn't think much of it at first. Could have been a deer or a stray dog, but something about it bothered me. It felt off. "Did you see that?" I asked, more to myself than to her. "See what?" she replied. "Nothing," I said, shaking my head. "Probably just an animal." We kept driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few miles later, we passed another pull-off, and this time I saw it clearly. A man standing in the trees, watching us. He was wearing a dark Mackinaw and jeans, nothing out of the ordinary, but the way he was standing there so still gave me the creeps. I didn't say anything to Lisa. No point in scaring her, but I kept an eye on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of trouble. We reached the town without incident, and I dropped her off at a gas station. She thanked me again, offered to pay for my lunch or something, but I waved it off. Just doing my job. After she went inside, I parked the truck and walked over to a diner across the street. It was one of those old-school places with vinyl booths and a counter lined with stools. I ordered a burger and a coffee, trying to shake off the weird feeling from earlier. I was halfway through my meal when I saw him, the man from the trees. He walked into the diner like he owned the place, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just stared. My heart started pounding, but I kept my cool. I've dealt with all sorts of people on the road, and the last thing you want to do is show fear. He walked over and sat down at the counter, 2 seats away from me. Up close, I could see he was older than I'd thought, maybe in his 50s. He had a scar running down the side of his face, and his eyes were cold. Dead. "Nice day for a drive," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep it casual. "Just another day on the road." He didn't say anything else, just sat there staring at me. I finished my meal quickly, paid the check, and left. As I walked back to my truck, I glanced over my shoulder. He was still sitting there, watching me through the window. I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, my mind racing. Who was this guy? Why was he following me? I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, my eyes constantly flicking to the mirrors. I didn't see him again, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. I drove for another hour, my nerves on edge, until I reached a rest area. It was one of those places with a few picnic tables and a bathroom, nothing fancy. I pulled in, parked, and got out to stretch my legs. The place was empty, just me and the trees. I was about to climb back into the cab when I heard a noise, a twig snapping maybe, or a footstep. I turned, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing, just the wind, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I climbed back into the truck, locked the doors, and settled in for the night. I always carry a baseball bat with me, just in case, and I pulled it out from behind the seat, laying it across my lap. I didn't sleep much. Every little noise outside made me jump. Sometime in the early morning, just before dawn, I heard it, a soft tap on the window, like someone was trying to get my attention. I froze, my hand tightening around the bat. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. I took a deep breath and slowly turned my head. There, standing right outside the window, was the man from the diner. His face was inches from the glass, his eyes staring straight into mine. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there. Stood there. I reacted without thinking. I swung the bat at the window, shattering the glass. He jumped back and I scrambled to open the door, ready to fight, but he was gone, vanished into the trees. I didn't waste any time. I started the engine and floored it, not caring about the noise or the damage. I drove like a madman, my heart pounding, until I reached a larger town with a police station. I stumbled inside, barely able to speak. The officers were skeptical at first, another trucker with a crazy story, but they sent a car to the rest area to check it out. They found the broken window, but no sign of the man. I filed a report, gave them all the details, but I knew it wouldn't do much good. This guy was smart, careful. He'd vanish into the woods and reappear somewhere else. A ghost on the highway. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stopped, I scanned the area, half expecting to see him lurking in the shadows. I started carrying a gun, something I'd never felt the need for before. I heard from other truckers about strange encounters, people going missing, stories that made my skin crawl. I don't know if any of them were connected to the man I saw, but it made me wary, cautious. Eventually, the fear faded, replaced by a kind of grim acceptance. The road is dangerous. It always has been. You take your chances, keep your wits about you, and hope for the best. But I never forgot that face, those cold, dead eyes, and I know somewhere out there, he's still watching, still waiting. My name's Addison Sullivan. Back in 2014, I found myself in the middle of Glacier National Park in Montana, drawn to the place by my grandfather's tales. He was Blackfoot, and every year he'd tell me of the silent ones that wandered the mountains when the snow melted, creatures that came with the change of the season, hidden in plain sight. He'd laugh when he said it, but it was one of those laughs that never reached his eyes. I brushed off the stories as I grew up, just as we all do, but somewhere they lingered. Maybe that's why I'd set off that summer, thinking a bit of isolation and mountain air might clear up some lingering junk in my own life. Day 2 of my trip, and the solitude was a welcome shift from city noise. My one mistake. I hadn't realized Glacier had certain areas with little to no cell reception, so I was technically cut off. But I liked it that way. There was something pure about it. No notifications, no emails, just me, the wild, and a tent that barely held up against the mountain wind. I'd picked a camping spot a few miles off the main trails, close to the dense cedar forest that lined the mountainsides, a place where few hikers ever bothered to go. Most campers preferred the lower parts, nearer to the lakes or established campsites. Up here, it was just me in the wilderness. At dusk on my second night, I was sitting by the fire I'd scraped together, eating what passed as dinner, soggy noodles and canned beans, when I heard something odd. Now, anyone who spends time outdoors knows that nature makes its own kind of racket. Insects buzz, birds call out, even the wind has a rhythm to it. But this sound was off. It was low, shuffling, like something big trying to move quietly. I glanced around, expecting maybe a deer or, at worst, a bear nosing through the bushes. Instead, I saw nothing. I convinced myself it was my mind playing tricks, so I laughed it off, throwing a few pine cones into the fire and saying some sarcastic line to nobody in particular. But then, just as I started to relax, the noise began again, closer this time and somehow heavier. It didn't feel like the sound of something harmless. It felt deliberate. With every second, the silence around it grew more intense. It felt as though the whole forest held its breath, waiting for something. I could barely see anything in the faint light of the fire, but my instincts had kicked into overdrive. I grabbed the flashlight I'd packed, figuring the light would scare off whatever it was. But when I flicked it on, my gut sank. About 10 feet from my camp, just within the reach of the flashlight, was something crouched low to the ground. It was hunched over, one knee bent, one leg stretched out behind. Its stance looked almost human, almost but not quite. It had a shape to it, like a man who'd been stretched, the limbs wrong, too long, the joints at angles that shouldn't have been possible. Its skin was mottled, a pale gray like tree bark in the dead of winter, with dark, jagged lines snaking across its body. It stared at me, unmoving, waiting. I don't know what made me freeze. I dealt with wildlife before, but this was different. There was something about it that felt ancient, something that radiated a sense of wrongness, like it didn't belong here. My first reaction was stupid but instinctive. I tried to shout at it to make myself seem big, like you're supposed to do with a mountain lion. I waved my arms, called out, "Get lost!" like it was just some animal that could be intimidated. The thing tilted its head just a little, as if it found the whole thing amusing. And then it smiled. Not with its mouth exactly, more like its whole face twisted, muscles stretching and contorting to form what I could only guess was an attempt at a grin. It was like looking at a caricature of a smile, stretched too far, not fitting quite right, almost as if it was mimicking what it thought humans did. Then, quick as a flash, it straightened up to its full height, towering over me by at least a foot. Limbs too long, arms that hung low and narrow, tapering into thin fingers, nearly claw-like. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and landing in the dirt, casting eerie shadows that danced across its twisted form. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, to find some logical explanation, but this thing, it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. Not in books, not in the woods, nowhere. As I struggled to pick up the flashlight, my hand found a rock instead. I hurled it, a last-ditch instinctive attempt to keep it at bay. The rock bounced off it like hitting a tree trunk. Then it moved, fast, the kind of speed that doesn't belong to something that size. It was beside me in seconds, close enough for me to smell this odd, bitter scent, like damp rot mixed with an iron tang. Its fingers brushed my arm just lightly, like it was testing me, trying to gauge my reaction. I remember thinking that maybe it would just study me, maybe it would let me go, but then I heard a scream, high-pitched and close, one that cut through the night air like a blade. I realized with horror that it wasn't coming from me. It was coming from further up the trail, somewhere close by. Another camper, perhaps, or a hiker who had taken a wrong turn. Whoever it was, they didn't have long, because that creature, no, that thing, had already whipped its head around, focusing on the new source of sound. I watched in stunned silence as it darted away, moving with a gait that was too smooth, too inhuman. It was only a matter of moments before I heard a second scream, shorter, more desperate, followed by a strange wet sound, the kind you hear in butcher shops. My instinct screamed at me to run, to bolt down the trail and not look back, but something held me in place. I crouched low, inching closer to where the sounds had come from, keeping to the shadows, my pulse roaring in my ears. In the dim light, I could see its silhouette bent over something or someone. I couldn't make out details, but I saw enough to know that I needed to get out fast. I turned, pushing back toward my camp, hands shaking as I threw whatever I could into my bag. Food, flashlight, a knife I'd brought but somehow hadn't thought to use. As I slung the bag over my shoulder, I heard the crack of a branch behind me, the soft, creeping footsteps of something that moved too lightly for its size. My stomach twisted, and I pushed myself forward, ignoring the burning in my legs, the ache in my lungs. I ran down the mountain path, every shadow now a potential threat, every sound amplified in the darkness. The creature kept close enough that I could hear it sometimes, that faint shuffling sound just behind me as though it enjoyed the chase. I must have stumbled a dozen times, scraping my hands raw, feeling my knees buckle, but I didn't dare slow down. Every time I thought I'd lost it, that silence would creep back, and then I'd hear the faintest of footsteps, that strange, sickly sweet scent wafting through the air. When I finally broke through to the lower trailhead, the park ranger's cabin was within sight. I stumbled into it, nearly colliding with the wooden door. A young ranger, maybe in his 20s, looked up in shock as I burst in, rambling about what I'd seen, telling him about the screams, the creature. His eyes went wide, but he didn't look surprised. He looked resigned, like he'd heard this all before. He tried to calm me down, asking questions, trying to gather details. He mentioned something about an old story, something passed down by the locals about creatures that came out with the changing seasons. He muttered under his breath, something about when to go, though he quickly changed the subject when he saw me trying to catch what he was saying. When other rangers returned, they headed up the mountain, but they didn't find anyone else. No bodies, no blood, no sign of struggle. Only my footprints, erratic and wild, were traced along the dirt. They marked it off as nothing more than hysteria, maybe an animal attack. They told me to rest, get some sleep, and to take a few days off from any heavy hiking. My name is David Walsh, and this happened to me on a cool autumn weekend last year. I'd taken my RV out to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington State for a bit of solitude, to get away from the daily grind. The plan was simple: park the RV, hike around, maybe do a little fishing, and just relax. I invited my friend Mason McCree along because, frankly, he needed a break more than I did. Mason had been going through a tough divorce, and I thought a weekend in the woods might clear his head. Mason is the kind of guy who's always up for an adventure, and he didn't hesitate to join. We set up camp near a small, serene lake. There was nobody around for miles, just the way we liked it. We spent the first day setting up, chopping firewood, and catching up on life over a couple of beers. It felt like the perfect getaway. The next morning, we decided to hike a bit deeper into the forest. Mason, always the more adventurous one, suggested we explore a trail that wasn't on the map. He figured it would lead us to some untouched fishing spots. I agreed, and we set off, joking and laughing, feeling free from the worries back home. After a couple of hours of hiking, we came across an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, and curiosity got the better of us. Mason suggested we check it out, and I reluctantly agreed. As we approached, the air felt heavier, but I shrugged it off as just part of the forest's natural ambience. The cabin was a mess: broken furniture, shattered windows, and walls covered in strange, almost tribal-looking symbols. Mason, always the bold one, started rummaging through the debris. I stayed by the door, feeling a bit uneasy. "Hey, David, check this out," Mason called out, holding up an old leather-bound journal. We flipped through it, finding pages filled with cryptic notes and drawings of creatures I had never seen before. It felt like something out of an old legend or a horror story. The more we read, the more uneasy I felt. "Man, this is weird," I said, my voice echoing in the empty cabin. "Let's get out of here." Mason agreed, and we left the cabin, making our way back to the RV. The day passed without incident, but something about that cabin stuck with me. That night, as we sat by the campfire, we heard a noise in the distance, something moving through the trees. Mason laughed it off, saying it was probably just a deer or a raccoon, but the noise didn't stop. It grew closer, heavier, like something large was moving our way. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Mason replied, now more serious. "Grab the flashlight." I fumbled for the flashlight, turning it on and pointing it towards the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but we saw nothing. The forest was eerily quiet now, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. "Maybe we should go inside," I suggested. Mason nodded, and we quickly put out the fire and retreated to the safety of the RV. Inside, we locked the doors and double-checked the windows. We sat there in silence, listening. After a while, the noises stopped, and we began to relax, laughing nervously at our overactive imaginations. But then, just as we were starting to drift off to sleep, we heard it. A scratching sound, faint at first but unmistakable. It was coming from the side of the RV. Mason and I exchanged glances, both of us wide-eyed and fully awake now. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. Mason shook his head. "I don't know, man, but I'm not going out there." We sat in tense silence, the scratching growing louder, more insistent. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the only weapon I had, and handed Mason a heavy flashlight. We moved slowly toward the door, our hearts pounding in our chests. "On 3, Mason whispered. 1, 2, 3. He flung the door open, and I shone the flashlight into the darkness. For a moment, we saw nothing. Then, from the corner of the RV, something moved, something big. It was covered in matted fur with glowing eyes that reflected the flashlight's beam. I don't know what it was, but it let out a sound that froze my blood. Mason slammed the door shut, and we bolted it, backing away as the RV shook with the force of the creature's attack. "We need to get out of here," I shouted. Mason nodded, fumbling with the keys. He started the engine, and we peeled out of the campsite, the creature chasing us for a few terrifying moments before it disappeared into the forest. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached a small town. We went straight to the local sheriff's office, telling our story between gasps for breath. The sheriff, an older man named Daniel Whitaker, listened patiently, though I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "You boys been drinking?" he asked. "No, sir," Mason replied, his voice steady. "We know what we saw." Sheriff Whitaker sighed and rubbed his chin. "All right, I'll send a couple of deputies out to take a look, but you two should get some rest." We thanked him and found a motel, locking ourselves in the room and pushing furniture against the door. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it was filled with nightmares of glowing eyes and scratching claws. The next day, we went back to the sheriff's office. He told us the deputies had found our campsite in disarray, but no sign of the creature, no tracks, no fur, nothing. "You sure you didn't imagine it?" he asked. "We didn't imagine it," I insisted. "It was real." The sheriff nodded slowly. "All right. Best thing you can do is stay away from that area. Sometimes the forest plays tricks on folks." We left, feeling frustrated and helpless. Mason and I parted ways after that trip, both of us shaken by the experience. We didn't talk about it much afterward, each trying to forget in our own way. Months passed, and life went back to a semblance of normal. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, or hear a strange noise in the night, and I'd be right back in that RV, facing the unknown. Mason and I still keep in touch, though our conversations steer clear of that weekend. I know he remembers it as vividly as I do, and neither of us is eager to relive it. I never did find out what that creature was. Maybe it was just a bear or some other animal, and our minds played tricks on us in the dark. Or maybe there are things out there that defy explanation, lurking in the corners of the world. Either way, I'm not keen to go camping again anytime soon. Some things are better left unexplored, and some stories are best left untold. But I'll always remember that weekend and the sense of dread that still lingers when I think of those glowing eyes. People in town started calling it Fenrir, after the monstrous wolf from Norse mythology. I don't know if that's what it really was, but the name stuck. Every so often I hear whispers of sightings of campers going missing in the woods. I just hope I never cross paths with Fenrir again. My name is Jennifer Murphy, and this happened to me on May 13th, 2002. It was supposed to be a laid-back camping trip. Just me, my buddy Mason, and our old RV parked by a remote part of the Green River in Utah. We weren't looking for adventure, just a weekend away from our regular lives. Mason worked construction, and I ran a small bait and tackle shop. Nothing too fancy, just two guys in need of some quiet time with nature, beers, and fishing rods. We'd found a spot not far from Horseshoe Canyon, far enough off the beaten path to avoid the crowds. The place was perfect, quiet, isolated, and right next to the river. We set up camp, got a fire going, and cracked open a couple of beers. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was one of those moments that make you feel alive and grateful for the little things. As the night fell, the conversation turned to the usual stuff. Mason was complaining about his boss, and I was telling him about a weird customer I'd had that week. We laughed, roasted marshmallows, and eventually decided to call it a night. The RV was old but comfortable. It had a little kitchenette, a fold-out table, and 2 bunk beds, cozy enough for a weekend. The first night was uneventful. We woke up early, eager to get to the river. Fishing was good. We caught a couple of bass and a trout. By mid-afternoon, we were back at camp, grilling our catch and feeling pretty pleased with ourselves. The day went by in a blur of good food, lazy conversation, and cold beers. It was exactly what we needed. That evening, as we were sitting by the fire again, Mason noticed something odd. "Hey, Owen, did you see that?" he asked, squinting into the trees. "See what?" I replied, not really paying attention. "I thought I saw something move over there," he said, pointing towards a dense clump of trees about 50 yards away. I looked but saw nothing. "Probably just an animal. This is their turf, after all," I said, trying to reassure him. Mason shrugged it off, and we went back to our beers and stories, but I could tell he was uneasy. Every now and then, he'd glance toward the trees, as if expecting to see something. It was getting late, so we decided to head inside and call it a night. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. It was a soft scratching, like something was brushing against the side of the RV. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too deliberate. I nudged Mason, who was snoring in the bunk below mine. "Mason, you hear that?" I whispered. He grunted, half asleep. "Hear what?" "That scratching noise. Listen." We both stayed quiet, and there it was again, a slow, deliberate scratching. Mason sat up, fully awake now. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. "I don't know. Maybe an animal," I suggested, but even I didn't believe it. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously opened the door. The night was pitch black, and the fire had long died out. The air was still and silent. We scanned the area with our lights, but saw nothing, just the trees and the river beyond. "I don't see anything," Mason said, sounding relieved. "Yeah, maybe it was nothing," I agreed, though I still felt uneasy. We went back inside, but sleep didn't come easy. Every creak and groan of the RV had me on edge. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. The next morning, we found deep scratches on the side of the RV, right where we'd heard the noise. Long, jagged marks that didn't look like they were made by any animal. Mason and I exchanged uneasy glances. "This isn't normal, man," Mason said, running his fingers over the scratches. "What kind of animal does this?" "I don't know. Maybe a bear, I guess," though I knew it didn't look right. We decided to stay close to camp that day. The fun, carefree atmosphere of the previous day was gone. We were jumpy, constantly looking over our shoulders. By late afternoon, the tension was unbearable. "Maybe we should pack up and leave," Mason suggested. I was about to agree when we heard it again, that same scratching noise. But this time it was coming from the woods. We froze, staring in the direction of the sound. It was getting closer. "Get inside now," I hissed. We scrambled into the RV, slamming the door behind us. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Mason grabbed a kitchen knife, the only weapon we had. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Typical. The scratching stopped suddenly, replaced by a heavy silence. We stayed inside, holding our breath, listening. Then a loud thud against the door made us both jump. "What the hell is out there?" Mason whispered, his face pale. I shook my head, unable to answer. The thud came again, harder this time. The door creaked under the pressure. "Whatever it is, it's trying to get in," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Mason tightened his grip on the knife. "We need to make a run for it. Get to the car and get the hell out of here." Our car was parked about 20 feet from the RV, a short distance that now seemed like a mile. But he was right. We couldn't stay trapped inside. We counted to 3, threw the door open, and bolted toward the car. I reached the driver's side and yanked the door open. Mason was right behind me, diving into the passenger seat. As I fumbled for the keys, I glanced back at the RV and saw it, a massive, hulking figure standing in the shadows. It was covered in matted fur, with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. "Drive! Drive!" Mason yelled, snapping me out of my daze. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. We sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, about 20 miles away. We pulled into a gas station, both of us shaking. Mason was still clutching the knife, his knuckles white. I could hardly believe what had just happened. "What the hell was that thing?" Mason asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know. I've never seen anything like it," I replied, my mind racing. We called the local sheriff and reported what happened. They took us seriously enough, sending a couple of deputies to check the campsite. We waited anxiously, hoping for some kind of explanation. When the deputies returned, they looked spooked. "There were more scratches on the RV," one of them said, "and some tracks in the dirt, big ones. We're not sure what made them." Mason and I exchanged a look. It was clear we weren't going back there, ever. We stayed in town that night at a cheap motel. Neither of us slept much. The events of the day replayed in my mind over and over. What had we seen? What was out there? In the morning, we drove back to the city, silent for most of the ride. When we finally got home, I parked the RV in my driveway and stared at it. Those deep scratches, a constant reminder of what had happened. We told our friends and families about the trip, but no one really believed us. They thought we were pulling a prank, or maybe we'd had too much to drink. But we knew what we'd seen. Something was out there, lurking in those woods. Mason and I drifted apart after that. He moved to another state, started a new job. I sold the bait shop and got a regular 9-to-5. The RV sat unused for years, a relic of a trip gone wrong. Every now and then I'd have nightmares about that night. The scratching, the thud against the door, those glowing eyes. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing. I never went camping again. Years later, I heard a story on the news about some hikers who went missing near the Green River. They found their campsite abandoned, with deep scratches on their tent and gear scattered around. It brought it all back, those memories I tried so hard to forget. People around here have started calling it the Rock, some kind of local legend now, a creature that haunts the remote parts of the woods. I don't know if that's what it was, but the name stuck. All I know is something's out there, and it's not something you want to mess with. If you ever find yourself by the Green River, remember my story. Stay close to civilization, and if you hear scratching in the night, run. Don't look back. My name is Eli Pierce, and this happened to me in July of 1990. I had just turned 40, and I decided it was time for a little solo adventure to clear my head. I'd been through a rough patch, a bad breakup, and work had been grinding me down. So I packed up my old RV and headed out to the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, hoping to find some peace in the wilderness. I parked the RV in a small, quiet campground. It was one of those places that don't show up on maps, the kind you hear about from a friend of a friend. There were only 3 other campers in the area, spaced out far enough that it felt like I had the whole forest to myself. I liked it that way. The first night was uneventful. I cooked up some beans on the camp stove and settled in with a book. I remember the quiet being almost unsettling after the constant noise of the city. I slept well, though better than I had in months. The next day, I decided to explore the trails. I hiked for hours, losing myself in the rhythm of my footsteps and the sounds of nature around me. Around midday, I stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It was nestled in a dense thicket, almost hidden from view. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a look inside. The cabin was a relic from another time. Dust covered everything, and the air smelled of mold and decay. There were old newspapers strewn across the floor, dating back to the 1970s. As I poked around, I found a trapdoor in the corner leading down to a cellar. I'm not sure what possessed me to open it, but I did. The cellar was dark and musty. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it around. That's when I saw it. Bones, human bones. They were scattered across the floor, yellowed with age. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a wave of nausea. I backed out of the cellar and stumbled out of the cabin, my mind racing. I decided to head back to the campground and report what I'd found. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest, which had felt so peaceful before, now seemed oppressive and sinister. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I saw nothing. When I got back to the campground, I went straight to the ranger's office. It was a small, rundown building, and the ranger on duty looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. His name was Logan, a grizzled old man with a permanent scowl. "Logan, I found something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's an old cabin up the trail, and there are bones in the cellar. Human bones." Logan's scowl deepened. "You sure about that?" "Yes, I'm sure," I insisted. He sighed and grabbed his radio. "Stay here," he said. "I'll go check it out." I waited for what felt like hours. Finally, Logan returned, looking pale and shaken. "You weren't kidding," he muttered. "I've called the sheriff. They'll be here soon." The sheriff, a stocky man named Daniel, arrived with a couple of deputies. They questioned me about what I'd seen and then went up to the cabin to investigate. They were gone for most of the afternoon, and when they returned, they looked grim. "We'll need to cordon off the area," Daniel said. "This is now a crime scene." The other campers were buzzing with curiosity and unease. One of them, a guy named Matthew, approached me. He was a tall, lanky fellow with a thick southern drawl. "What's going on, man?" he asked. "I heard something about bones." I nodded. "Yeah, I found some old bones in a cabin. The sheriff thinks it might be a crime scene." Matthew whistled. "Damn, that's some creepy stuff. You think it's safe out here?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I've got a bad feeling about this, though." That night, the campground was eerily quiet. Everyone had retreated to their RVs and tents, and the usual sounds of campfire chatter and laughter were absent. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I double-checked the locks on my RV and kept my flashlight close. Sometime after midnight, I heard a noise outside. It was a soft shuffling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I held my breath and listened. The sound grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I peered out the window. In the dim light, I saw a figure moving between the trees. I grabbed a baseball bat I kept by the door and stepped outside, my hands shaking. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure stopped and turned toward me. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see that it was tall with long, tangled hair. It didn't move, just stood there watching me. I took a step forward, and that's when it lunged at me. I swung the bat, but it was fast, too fast. It knocked me to the ground, and I felt a sharp pain in my side. I struggled, kicking and swinging the bat wildly, but it was no use. The thing was strong, unbelievably strong. Just as I thought I was done for, a gunshot rang out. The creature released me and fled into the woods. I lay there, gasping for breath, trying to process what had just happened. Matthew came running over, a rifle in his hands. "You okay?" he asked, helping me to my feet. "I think so," I gasped. "What the hell was that?" Matthew shook his head. "I don't know, man, but it ain't human, that's for sure." We went to the ranger's office and Logan patched me up as best he could. I had a deep gash in my side, but it wasn't life-threatening. We told Logan what had happened and he radioed the sheriff again. Daniel arrived with his deputies and they searched the woods, but they found nothing, no trace of the creature that had attacked me. "We'll keep a patrol out here tonight," Daniel said, "but I suggest you folks pack up and leave in the morning. It's not safe here." I didn't argue. The next morning, I packed up my RV and prepared to leave. Matthew came over to say goodbye. "Take care, man," he said, "and stay safe." "You too," I replied. "Thanks for saving my life." He shrugged, just glad I was in the right place at the right time. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. I never found out what that creature was, and I never went back to that campground. It's been almost 30 years, and I still have nightmares about that night. I've read about strange sightings and encounters in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and I can't help but wonder if it's the same thing that attacked me. Folks around here have a name for it now. They call it Grim, like something out of a folktale, and I believe it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. My name is Jennifer Lopez, and back in 2013, I decided to take my RV up to the quiet outskirts of Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, for a much-needed break. Being a middle-aged guy with a penchant for bad puns and burnt toast, I figured some solitude in the Canadian wilderness would do me good. You know, there's only so many times you can microwave instant noodles before questioning your life choices. I had recently bought this old RV off a guy who swore it was vintage, fancy term for rust bucket, but it had character. The kind of character that made weird noises at night and had a heater that worked only when it felt like it. But it was mine, and it was freedom on wheels. The drive up was uneventful, which in itself felt like a minor miracle. No flat tires, no engine hiccups, just miles of open road and a playlist of 80s rock to keep me company. As I pulled into the campsite, I noticed it was nearly empty, except for a couple of other RVs spaced far apart. Perfect social distancing before it was cool. I parked near a serene lake that mirrored the sky like a flawless painting. Setting up was a breeze. I unfolded my lawn chair, cracked open a cold beer, and took a deep breath of the crisp, pine-scented air. This was the life. No emails, no deadlines, just me and Mother Nature. I even attempted to fish, which is to say, I sat by the water with a rod and hoped the fish were as lazy as I was. As evening approached, I lit up a small campfire. The flames danced merrily, casting a warm glow and keeping the mosquitoes at bay. I was roasting marshmallows, burning them to a crisp, actually, when I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. "Mind if I join you?" a man's voice asked. I turned to see a fellow camper, a tall, lanky guy with glasses that seemed a tad too big for his face. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, carrying a folding chair under one arm and a six-pack in the other. "Sure thing," I replied. "Pull up a seat." "Name's Jennifer," I added. "David," he said, unfolding his chair next to mine. "Saw your fire and figured I'd come say hello. Campsite's a bit lonely this time of year." "Tell me about it," I said. I was beginning to think I'd have to start talking to myself. We both chuckled. David offered me a beer and we settled into easy conversation. He was a software engineer on a break, trying to disconnect from the digital world. I joked that between the two of us, we probably had enough social skills to order a pizza without stammering. As the night wore on, we shared stories and laughed more than I had in months. At one point, David tried to tell a joke about a bear walking into a bar but forgot the punchline halfway through. "Guess the bear did too," I quipped, and we burst into laughter. Around midnight, David yawned and stood up. "Well, I'm going to hit the sack. Thanks for the company, Jennifer." "Anytime, buddy. Sleep tight." He wandered off toward his RV, and I decided to call it a night as well. I doused the fire and stepped inside my RV, the cool air greeting me like an old friend. Climbing into bed, I felt content. It had been a good day. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. Half asleep, I figured it was a branch brushing against the RV. It stopped after a few seconds, and I drifted back to sleep. Morning came bright and early, the sun piercing through the thin curtains. I stretched and decided to check on David, maybe invite him for a makeshift breakfast of toast and whatever else I could scavenge from my limited pantry. Stepping outside, I noticed David's RV door was slightly ajar. "Hey, David," I called out, walking toward it. No response. Maybe he was an early riser and had gone for a hike. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked inside. David's RV was empty, but the bed was unmade, and his belongings were scattered about, as if he had left in a hurry. Odd. I shrugged it off and spent the day exploring a nearby trail. The forest was lush and full of life, squirrels darting up trees, birds singing tunes, and me tripping over roots like it was a hobby. I even found a neat little waterfall, the kind you see on postcards. Returning to the campsite in the late afternoon, I noticed David's RV was still there, untouched since the morning. A prickly feeling crawled up my neck. It wasn't like him to be gone all day without mentioning any plans. I decided to check with the campsite manager, a gruff older man named John who looked like he'd wrestled a moose or two in his day. "Excuse me, John," I began. "Have you seen my friend David? He's in the RV over there, but seems to be missing." John raised an eyebrow. "David? Can't say I have. You're the only camper registered at this spot." I frowned. "That can't be right. He and I chatted last night. His RV is parked right next to mine." John gave me a puzzled look. "Son, that RV's been there for over a week. Belongs to a fella named Mark Higgins. He hasn't checked out yet, but I haven't seen him around." A knot formed in my stomach. "Could you maybe check the registration again?" He sighed, but humored me, flipping through a worn ledger. "Nope. No David. Just you and Mr. Higgins." I thanked him and walked back, unease settling in. If David wasn't registered, then who was he? And where was he now? As evening approached, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I returned to David's, or rather Mark's RV, and tried knocking again. Silence. The door was still ajar, and after a moment's hesitation, I stepped inside. The interior was messy, clothes strewn about, dishes piled in the sink. But what caught my eye was a notebook on the small dining table. It was open, pages filled with handwriting. Curiosity overriding caution, I picked it up and flipped through. I realized it was a journal. Entries detailed travels across various campsites, observations about fellow campers, and unsettlingly detailed descriptions of interactions that ended abruptly. Then I saw my name. "Jennifer Lawson arrived today," one entry read. "Seems friendly, a bit too trusting. Could be an interesting one." A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Flipping further, I found a sketch of me sitting by the fire. The details were meticulous, the folds of my maisonette, the way I held my beer bottle. I needed to leave now. As I turned to exit, I heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching. Panic surged through me. I quickly hid behind the small curtain separating the sleeping area from the rest of the RV. The door creaked open. Through a sliver in the curtain, I saw David, or whoever he was, enter. He hummed a tune softly, almost cheerfully. In his hand was a large hunting knife, the blade glinting ominously. Now, where did we leave off? He mused aloud. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I glanced around desperately for an escape route or a weapon, spotting a heavy frying pan on the stove. I inched toward it as quietly as possible. He moved deeper into the RV, his back turned to me. Seizing the moment, I lunged forward and struck him on the back of the head with the pan. He stumbled but didn't go down, turning to face me with a twisted grin. "That wasn't very nice," he said calmly. I didn't wait for a second chance. I bolted past him, shoving him aside, and sprinted out of the RV. Behind me, I heard him give chase. The campsite was eerily empty. I yelled for help, but my voice seemed swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness. Reaching my RV, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Just as I got the door open, he grabbed my shoulder, wrenching me back. We struggled, and I managed to kick him hard in the knee. He let out a grunt, a small victory. I scrambled inside, slamming the door and locking it. He banged on the door, the knife scratching against the metal. "Come on, Jennifer, we were having fun," he shouted, his voice sing-songy and mocking. I started the engine, my hands still trembling. The RV roared to life, and without bothering to disconnect the power or pack up, I floored it. The vehicle lurched forward, knocking him aside. In the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, watching me drive away. The knife was still in his hand, his expression a mix of amusement and irritation. I drove non-stop until I reached the nearest town, heading straight to the police station. Bursting inside, I must have looked like a madman, disheveled, panicked, and babbling about a psychopath in the woods. The officers took my statement and sent a patrol car to the campsite. They found David's, Mark's, RV, but reported that it was empty inside. However, they discovered evidence that made their faces pale. Photos of various campers, notes detailing movements, and a collection of driver's licenses. Among them was one belonging to a missing person reported months ago. "You're lucky to be alive," one of the officers told me grimly. They launched a manhunt but didn't find him. It was as if he had vanished into the wilderness. A week later, I received a call from Detective Harris, who was handling the case. "We've identified the man you encountered," he said. "His real name is Leonard Price, wanted in connection with multiple disappearances across several provinces. Do you think he'll be caught?" I asked. "We're doing everything we can. In the meantime, stay vigilant." I hung up the phone, a mix of relief and lingering dread washing over me. Leonard Price, a name that would haunt many. But at least now there was a chance he'd be stopped. I later learned that Leonard had a pattern. He targeted solitary campers, earning their trust before turning on them. His motivations were still unclear, perhaps even to himself. As for me, I sold the RV and decided that maybe my next vacation would involve a crowded beach or a bustling city, someplace where the only danger was overpriced souvenirs. My name is Hudson Murphy, and this happened to me on February 10th, 2010. I'm not much for writing, but I wanted to get this down while it's still fresh. I'd been planning this camping trip with my buddies for a few months. We were all due for some time off, and I figured an RV trip would be the perfect getaway. The place we picked was the Black Hills in South Dakota. Not many people go there this time of year, and that's just how we liked it. My friends Mason and Logan were excited too. Mason's a tall guy, used to play college basketball. Logan, on the other hand, is short and stocky, but what he lacks in height, he makes up for with a loud personality. I picked them up, and we set off in my old RV, joking and laughing the whole way. We arrived at the campsite in the early afternoon. It was a small clearing surrounded by dense trees, and the nearest town was about 20 miles away. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, but we didn't mind. We set up camp, got the fire going, and cracked open some beers. We spent the evening talking about old times, our jobs, and our plans for the future. It was good to be away from everything, just us and the wilderness. After a few hours, Mason suggested we go for a night hike. I wasn't too keen on the idea, but Logan was for it. "Come on, Randy. Where's your sense of adventure?" Logan teased. Reluctantly, I agreed. We grabbed some flashlights and set off into the woods. The night was clear and the moon provided some light, but the forest was dark and eerie. We walked for about half an hour, joking around and making fun of each other's nerves. Then we heard it, a rustling noise coming from the bushes ahead. "Probably just a deer," Mason said, though he didn't sound convinced. We pressed on, but the noise persisted. It seemed to be following us, keeping pace, just out of sight. Suddenly, Logan stopped. "Did you guys see that?" he whispered. I looked where he was pointing, and for a brief moment, I saw a shadow dart between the trees. "Let's head back," I said, feeling a knot form in my stomach. We turned around and started walking back to the RV, but the feeling of being watched stayed with us. The rustling grew louder, more insistent. Mason quickened his pace, and Logan and I followed suit. We reached the RV, and I locked the door behind us. Hard pounding. Maybe it was just an animal, Mason suggested, but we all knew it didn't feel right. We stayed inside the rest of the night, not talking much. I barely slept, every noise outside making me jump. The next morning, things seemed normal again. We laughed off the night's events, attributing it to our overactive imaginations. We spent the day hiking and exploring the area, taking photos, and enjoying the fresh air. By the evening, the previous night's fear seemed like a distant memory. As the sun set, we built another fire and settled in for another night of drinking and storytelling. Around midnight, Logan decided to turn in early. "I'll catch you guys in the morning," he said, heading into the RV. Mason and I stayed up for a while longer, but eventually we decided to call it a night too. I was just about to head inside when I heard a noise. It was a faint, almost imperceptible whispering. I turned to Mason. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" he asked, looking around. "That whispering," I said, straining to listen. Mason shook his head. "You're hearing things, man. Let's get some sleep." We went inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. Whispering, clearer this time. I sat up, heart racing. "Mason, do you hear that?" Mason grunted, half asleep. "Hear what?" "The whispering," I said, my voice shaking. Mason sat up, listening. Then we both heard it. A low, guttural voice speaking in a language neither of us understood. We looked at each other, eyes wide with fear. "Logan!" Mason shouted, jumping out of his bunk. We ran to Logan's bunk, but he was gone. His things were there, but there was no sign of him. We searched the RV, calling his name, but there was no response. "We need to find him," I said, grabbing a flashlight. We ran outside, shouting for Logan, but the forest was silent. We split up, searching the area around the campsite. I was about to give up when I heard Mason scream. I ran toward the sound, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I found Mason standing over something, his face pale. He pointed with a shaking hand. There, on the ground, was a trail of blood leading into the trees. "We need to call for help," I said, pulling out my phone, but there was no signal. We followed the blood trail, our fear mounting with each step. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be all around us, coming from the trees themselves. Finally, we came to a clearing, and what we saw froze us in our tracks. Logan was there, or what was left of him. His body was torn apart, scattered across the clearing. Standing over him was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was tall and gaunt, with long, vast, spindly limbs and a face twisted into a grotesque snarl. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and it seemed to be watching us, waiting. Mason and I backed away slowly, but the creature stepped forward, blocking our path. "Run!" I shouted, shoving Mason toward the trees. We ran blindly through the forest, the creature close behind. The whispering grew louder, more frenzied. I could hear Mason's heavy breathing, his footsteps pounding the ground beside me. We burst into the clearing where our RV was parked, and I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. "Get in!" I yelled, throwing open the door. Mason scrambled inside, and I slammed the door shut behind us. The creature slammed into the side of the RV, rocking it violently. I started the engine, flooring the gas pedal. The RV lurched forward, and I drove like a maniac, tearing down the narrow dirt road. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town. We stumbled into the local sheriff's office, babbling about what had happened. The sheriff, a grizzled old man named Tom, looked skeptical, but agreed to send a deputy to the campsite. We waited anxiously as the hours passed. Finally, the deputy returned, looking pale and shaken. There was nothing there, he said. No blood, no body, nothing. Mason and I looked at each other, stunned. "But we saw it," I insisted. "We saw Logan and that thing." The deputy shook his head. "I don't know what to tell you. Maybe you boys had too much to drink." We left the sheriff's office in a daze, not knowing what to believe. Logan was gone, and there was no trace of him. We returned home, our trip cut short. Mason and I didn't talk much after that. We tried to move on, but the memory of that night haunted us. A few months later, I was doing some research, trying to make sense of what had happened. I came across a local legend, a creature known as the Knack. According to the stories, the Knack was a malevolent spirit that hunted those who ventured too deep into the forest. It was said to whisper to its victims, driving them mad before it struck. I don't know if what we saw was the Knack, but I do know that something terrible happened in those woods. Something I can't explain. And every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I hear the whispering, faint but unmistakable, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. My name is Hudson Walsh, and in 2004, I found myself deep in the uninviting wilderness of the Wrangell St. Elias National Park in Alaska. Being stationed in the country's largest national park might sound impressive, but I can tell you right now there's nothing glamorous about days of combing dense forests and jagged, ice-covered slopes in search of people who usually didn't want to be found. But I've got a soft spot for the park. I've been working here for a solid 7 years, and most of the time I wouldn't trade it for anything, until I got a call from dispatch about an odd case, one that had already rattled the quiet community in McCarthy. 2 hikers, a couple by the name of Jod and Mark O'Connor, had gone missing after setting out for a backcountry trek. They were experienced hikers, the type who meticulously planned every trip, left detailed itineraries, and always checked in on schedule. But this time, they hadn't shown up, and their families were starting to get frantic. Normally, I'd write it off as bad luck or poor planning. People tend to underestimate how quickly this wilderness can turn on you. But there was a catch. They hadn't gone alone. They'd been in the company of a local guide, Sawyer Morgan, who was known to everyone in McCarthy. A rough guy, sure, with a dark sense of humor and a reputation for being a bit reckless, but he knew the land better than most. So when the 3 of them failed to return and no one had heard a whisper of them for 3 days, it struck a nerve in the tight-knit community. I set out early the next morning, feeling a little more apprehensive than usual. The air was bitter cold, slicing right through the layers I'd bundled up in. My partner for the day was Aidan Hargrave, a grizzled vet of the Park Service with a knack for telling off-color jokes at the worst possible times. He met me at the trailhead, cracking a grin that told me he was in a better mood than I was. "Hudson," he said, "do you ever get the feeling some folks are just begging for trouble? Look at this." He pointed at the tracks leading into the trees, barely visible beneath a fresh dusting of snow. Now, that ain't normal. You ever known Sawyer to get himself lost? No, I replied, trying to shake off the sense of foreboding creeping up on me. I hadn't. Sawyer was a bit of a hotshot, but the man knew his way around this place like it was his own backyard. Something didn't sit right, and as we trudged deeper into the forest, the feeling grew stronger. The trees loomed over us, skeletal and silent, a dense wall of dark green and white that seemed to close in tighter with every step. It was mid-afternoon when we stumbled across the first sign that something was wrong, a scattering of gear. Just a water bottle and a torn backpack strap lay half buried in the snow. Aiden picked up the bottle, turning it over in his hands. "Looks like Mark's," he said quietly, and then with his trademark humor creeping in, "Probably a case of a nasty breakup. Nothing like a snowstorm to bring out a couple's issues." I didn't laugh. There was a sharpness to the air, something I couldn't quite place. The snow was falling harder now, making it difficult to see too far ahead. Aiden and I pressed on, calling their names, hoping for any kind of response, but the forest swallowed every sound and the quiet started to feel unnatural. We kept walking until dusk, a steady plodding rhythm that numbed our limbs and frayed our nerves. Just as I was beginning to think we'd have to turn back for the night, I spotted something through the trees. A dark shape, hulking and motionless against the snow, barely discernible in the twilight. At first, I thought it was a downed tree, but as we approached, the smell hit me. Iron sharp and sickening. And then I saw it. The body of Sawyer Morgan, slumped and frozen, his skin a pale bluish hue against the snow. His jacket was shredded, hanging in tatters around his body, and his throat, it looked as though something had torn it open with a single swipe. Aiden swore under his breath, taking a step back. "Holy hell," he muttered. "That's not an accident." We circled the scene, examining the snow for tracks, trying to piece together what had happened, but the snow was disturbed. A mess of half-covered footprints and what looked like claw marks gouged into the ground. I'd seen my share of animal attacks, but this was something else. No bear or wolf could do this with such precision, and there wasn't a trace of blood anywhere except on the body. We marked the location and radioed in, telling dispatch we'd found one of the 3 missing hikers, but the response was static, broken up by the worsening storm. It was already getting dark, and with the temperature dropping fast, we knew we didn't have long before the cold would start taking its toll. Just then, we heard it. A faint sound, like something scraping against a tree, somewhere close by. Both of us froze, straining our ears, but the noise had stopped as quickly as it had started. Aiden whispered, "Alice, tell me you heard that." I nodded, gripping my flashlight a little tighter. The darkness around us seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. We moved slowly, inching forward when another sound broke the silence. It was closer this time, almost right beside us. A crunch, as if something heavy was moving through the snow, slowly, deliberately. I raised my flashlight, casting the beam over the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a massive shape standing just beyond the edge of the light, watching. I couldn't make out any details, just the bulk of it, like a bear but wrong. It was hunched, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and there was an unsettling intelligence in the way it moved. Then it lunged toward us. Aiden yelled, stumbling back as I aimed my light at the thing, catching a glimpse of claws that looked almost human, elongated fingers tipped with ragged nails. It made a sound, a deep, wet rasp, like it was struggling to breathe, and that was enough to send both of us running. We sprinted through the trees, stumbling over roots and rocks, the sound of its pursuit thundering behind us. I didn't dare look back, too focused on staying ahead of whatever that thing was. I could hear Aiden gasping, his footsteps pounding beside mine, and I prayed we'd make it to the trail before it closed the distance. But then, just as we broke through a clearing, I heard him cry out. I turned in time to see him go down, his body dragged back into the shadows as his flashlight flickered and died. His scream was cut short, leaving nothing but silence. I didn't stop. I couldn't. It was survival at that point, pure and simple. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. When I finally dared to stop, I realized I had no idea where I was. The The snow was falling in thick sheets now, covering my tracks and leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. The silence was oppressive, the forest unnaturally still. I crouched down, catching my breath, my mind racing as I tried to figure out my next move. That's when I heard it again, that scraping sound, soft and deliberate, coming from somewhere close. I ducked behind a tree, my heart pounding as I fumbled for my radio. I whispered into it, hoping for some miracle that it would pick up a signal, but all I got was static. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the trees, its head tilted as if studying me. Now that I could see it more clearly, I felt a wave of nausea. It had the body of a predator, lean and muscular, but its skin was stretched too tightly over its bones, giving it a twisted, almost human look. Its mouth was too wide, filled with rows of teeth that looked like they belonged to a shark, and those hands, long, bony fingers that flexed and curled as it watched me. I took a step back, my mind racing through my options, which weren't many. I didn't have a weapon, not even a pocket knife. Running seemed like a death sentence, but staying put wasn't much better. The creature took a step forward, its gaze fixed on me, and I knew I had to make a choice. In a desperate move, I turned and bolted, weaving between the trees, trying to lose it in the dense forest. The thing let out a guttural hiss, and I heard it crashing through the underbrush behind me. My legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last, but I pushed forward, ignoring the burning in my lungs. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I stumbled out of the forest and into a clearing, my chest heaving as I collapsed onto the ground. The storm had worsened, the snow blinding, and I realized I'd somehow circled back to where we'd found Sawyer's body. Except now, there were two bodies. Aiden lay sprawled in the snow, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his face frozen in a look of sheer terror. I staggered to my feet, my mind reeling. The thing had dragged him back here, left him as a warning, or maybe just for sport. I didn't want to stick around to find out which. I turned and stumbled through the snow, the cold seeping into my bones, numbing my fingers and toes. I kept moving, driven by pure instinct, not daring to look back. I could still feel it, somewhere in the darkness, following me, relentless and patient, its presence like a shadow pressing in around me. When I finally made it back to the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I collapsed onto the ground, the snow biting into my skin, but I didn't care. I was alive, and that was enough. It was 2003, and I was assigned to the Fremont-Wynma National Forest in southern Oregon, where things generally stayed quiet. My name's Wyatt Durand, and I'm a search and rescue officer for the U.S. Forest Service. Not the kind of job where you run into grizzly types, no. Our biggest concerns were usually lost campers or the occasional hiker with a sprained ankle. But that fall, the forest brought something else. The day started normal enough. I was sitting in the small outpost, finishing up a stale bagel and waiting for my partner, Saul Fletcher, to show up. Saul was one of those guys who never showed up on time, but at least he brought humor to the job. He said I was the stiffest SAR guy he'd ever met. Maybe he was right, but that day I wasn't complaining. The call came in around 8 a.m. A man named Richard Corbin had reported his brother, Alan, missing. Alan was an experienced backpacker, supposedly heading into the woods around Badger Lake 3 days ago. According to Richard, Alan wasn't the type to just wander off. He had gear, maps, and a radio, but he'd gone dark, and Richard was getting desperate. I grabbed my pack, loaded up on supplies, and waited for Saul to join me. When Saul finally arrived, 20 minutes late as expected, he had that grin on his face. "Wyatt, buddy, you look like you've already given up on life this morning." He shoved a thermos into my hands. "Coffee, trust me, you need it more than I do." We drove out to Badger Lake, a spot nestled within towering pines with steep trails that wound through rock formations covered in moss. It was the kind of place that felt endless, like you could walk for miles and never see another soul. Saul joked that the lake's quiet made it the perfect hideout for anyone who wanted to disappear, and I didn't argue. It was about an hour into our hike when we found Alan's campsite. His tent was still standing, but it looked like he'd left in a hurry. The fire pit had been doused hastily, with half-burnt wood still poking out of the ashes, and his pack, a solid green frame backpack, was just lying there outside the tent, unzipped and empty. Saul frowned. Not a good sign. If he'd been planning to leave, he'd have taken his gear. We called out, yelling Alan's name, listening to our voices echo in the vast, empty nothing. Just the wind rustling through the trees and that thick, eerie silence that only deep woods seem to carry. Then we noticed the tracks. They were scattered around the site like Alan had been moving in circles, maybe trying to evade something. But there was another set too, deep, uneven prints, like someone or something had been chasing him. Saul crouched down, his fingers brushing over the tracks. "Wyatt," he said, his tone unusually serious, "you ever seen anything like this?" The prints didn't match any animal I knew of. They were bigger than a bear's, with longer, almost skeletal impressions. I bent down to examine them closely, noting how the edges of each print were jagged, as though the creature's claws had dug into the ground with each step. "Let's keep going," I said, trying to shake off the unease gnawing at my gut. Maybe he's just up ahead. We followed the prints for half a mile, pushing through dense underbrush, moving deeper into the woods. The trail seemed to get narrower, like the trees were pressing in, thick and close, blocking out sunlight, and that's when we found the first sign of Alan. It was his radio, broken in half, lying among the rocks. Next to it, the ground was splattered with what looked suspiciously like blood. Not a lot, just enough to make your stomach turn. Saul was dead quiet, which was unlike him. This isn't right, Wyatt. A guy like Alan wouldn't just break his own radio. And this blood, it doesn't look like a scratch. It looks like something got him good. I nodded, too focused to respond. We pushed on, the silence between us heavy. That's when we heard it, a faint noise, almost like scratching coming from the trees ahead. We both froze, straining to listen. The sound was getting closer, rhythmic, dragging against the bark, like something large was moving slowly through the woods. Saul, despite his usual banter, gripped his flashlight like it was the only weapon he had. "Maybe we call it in?" he whispered, but I shook my head. We'd come this far, and whatever had left those tracks had to be found. We crept forward, our steps as quiet as we could make them. And then we saw it. At first, it looked like a silhouette, half hidden by shadows, standing unnaturally still between two massive trees. But as we got closer, details came into focus. The creature was hunched over, its limbs long and thin, with an almost insect-like bend to its joints. Its skin looked stretched, pale and slick, clinging to a little muscle it had. And the smell, a thick, cloying stench that made me gag. It was crouched over something, and as we got closer, I realized it was Alan, or at least what was left of him. The creature raised its head, and for a brief, frozen moment, our eyes met. It moved slowly, almost methodically, like it was studying us as much as we were studying it. Then, with sickening slow motion, it reached a clawed hand toward Alan's torso, lifting something dark and wet to its mouth. Saul took a step back, and a branch cracked under his boot. The creature's head snapped toward us, its thin lips pulling back in a mockery of a smile. And then it moved. It wasn't a run, not like any animal I'd seen. It was a lurching, bounding motion, each limb twisting as it propelled itself forward. I barely had time to yell before it was upon us, slashing wildly. I remember the pain of something sharp raking across my shoulder as I scrambled backward. Saul was yelling, swinging his flashlight like a club, trying to keep it at bay. The creature was relentless, its arms swinging with unnatural speed, cutting through the air with a sound like tearing fabric. Saul managed to land a hit, cracking it across what might have been its collarbone, but the thing barely flinched. It turned on him, claws flashing as it lunged. He screamed, a sound that cut off abruptly, and I saw him go down under the weight of the creature, its limbs tangled around him like a spider wrapping up prey. In that moment, I felt something snap. Survival instinct, maybe. I grabbed Saul's flashlight, now slick with his blood, and swung it with every bit of strength I had. I felt it connect, heard a crunch as the creature staggered back, hissing before fixing its gaze on me. For a brief second, we stared each other down. Then it lunged again, but I was ready. I swung the flashlight up, catching it under its chin, driving it back just enough to make a run for it. I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until the forest thinned out and the trees finally gave way to the dirt road where our truck was parked. I stumbled toward it, hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. As I slammed the door shut, I could see the creature standing at the edge of the trees, its pale form barely visible in the fading light. It didn't follow. It just watched, cocking its head to one side, like it was curious. Back at the station, I tried to piece together a report that didn't sound insane. They found Saul's body the next day, or what was left of it, tangled in the underbrush near Alan's remains. The tracks were there too, but no one could say for sure what made them. A couple of weeks later, I heard a rumor about old legends from the area. Supposedly, they spoke of a creature called the Thinning Walker, something that appeared in the woods when the fog was heavy and prey was plenty. My name is Jessica Johnson, and this happened to me on May 13th, 1992. I had taken my old RV out to the Ozarks for a weekend camping trip. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from my job in St. Louis. I'd always loved the solitude and the sense of disconnect from the world. My wife Karen had passed away a few years back, and these trips were my way of dealing with the grief. The weather was perfect that weekend, sunny with a slight breeze. I set up camp near a small, clear stream. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the forest was full of reds and golds. I parked the RV in a clearing and started a fire. It was just me and my dog Rusty, an old but loyal German Shepherd. That first day, I hiked a few trails, fished in the stream, and relaxed by the fire. I didn't see another soul, which was just how I liked it. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and distant owls. I cooked some dinner over the fire and settled in with a beer. Rusty lay by my feet, staring into the flames. Around midnight, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. It wasn't unusual to hear animals moving around at night, but this sounded different. Rusty perked up, ears pointed, and started a low rumble in his throat. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the noise, but saw nothing. I shrugged it off and went back to my beer, though I kept the flashlight within reach. The next day was more of the same, hiking and fishing. I found an old, abandoned cabin deeper in the woods. It looked like it had been there for decades, windows broken, roof caved in. I poked around a bit, but didn't find anything interesting. I headed back to camp as the sun started to set, planning to turn in early. That night, things got stranger. Around the same time, just past midnight, Rusty started growling again. This time, it was more intense. I heard the rustling again, closer. This time, I grabbed my flashlight and the knife and stepped out of the RV. I shone the light into the trees, and this time I saw it clearly, a tall, gaunt figure, its eyes reflecting the light. It was humanoid but twisted, with long limbs and a hunched back. It was covered in matted fur, and its face was distorted, almost animalistic. It stared at me for a moment, then disappeared into the darkness. I was frozen with fear. Rusty was going crazy, barking and pulling at his leash. I backed up toward the RV, keeping the flashlight trained on the spot where I had seen the creature. I could hear it moving around, circling the camp. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the fire going and sat with my back against the RV, knife in hand. Rusty stayed by my side, growling and barking whenever he heard something. I was scared out of my mind, but there was nothing I could do except wait for morning. When the sun finally came up, I decided to pack up and leave. I couldn't stay another night in those woods. I quickly loaded everything into the RV, keeping an eye on the tree line. Rusty was just as anxious to leave as I was. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature following us, but there was nothing. We made it back to St. Louis without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to put the experience behind me, but it haunted me. I did some research, looking for any stories or legends about creatures in the Ozarks, but I didn't find much. I told a few friends about what happened, but they just laughed it off, saying I probably had too much to drink. Years passed, but I never went back to the Ozarks. I sold the RV and bought a small cabin in the mountains, far from any forest. Rusty passed away a few years after the incident, and I got a new dog, but I never forgot that night. It wasn't until a few months ago that I heard something that sent chills down my spine. I was at a bar, talking to an old friend who was into cryptids. I told him my story, and he listened intently. When I was done, he nodded and said, "Sounds like you ran into the Wendigo." The name struck a chord with me. I'd heard it before, a Native American legend about a creature that was once human but had been transformed by a curse. It made sense in a way. The creature I saw was almost human, but not quite. It was something else, something ancient and evil. I don't know if what I saw was really a Wendigo, but it was enough to keep me out of the woods for the rest of my life. I still have nightmares sometimes, waking up in a cold sweat, hearing the rustling of leaves and the distant growl of something in the darkness. So that's my story. It's not something I like to talk about, but maybe sharing it will help me move on. If you ever find yourself in the Ozarks, be careful. There's something out there, something that's been there for a long time, waiting.
My name's Terry Mason, and back in 2020, I decided to set out on what I thought was just going to be a peaceful camping trip. I'd rented an RV and was headed up to the Boundary Waters in Minnesota, one of the last real wilderness areas left in the Midwest. I'd just gone through a messy breakup, one of those the dog stays with me deals, and thought that getting into the thick of nature might clear my head. Of course, I thought I'd be on my own for a few days, doing nothing more than fishing, grilling, maybe reading a bad detective novel. I wasn't really prepared for anything out of the ordinary. I mean, who would be? So there I was, parked at a site that was basically as far out as my RV could take me, not a single soul in sight. Just me and the trees pressing close, the smell of pine and the sounds of wind rushing through thick branches. I had my own little campfire going, cooking a half-burned hot dog and poking at the coals with a stick. The campsite was wedged between a rock face and a narrow trail that led into a small valley. The only access road was a twisting, barely there dirt path, something you'd need four-wheel drive just to crawl through, which was exactly why I'd chosen it. I figured it would be a nice, quiet evening, maybe even boring. Around dusk, though, I heard something in the distance. At first, I brushed it off as a deer or some animal rustling in the brush, but it got louder. It was the kind of sound that sticks in your gut, because it's too out of place. Not the typical crunch or snap of branches you'd expect, but something else, something heavier and somehow purposeful. I tried to laugh it off, muttering something dumb to myself like, "All right, Bigfoot, don't make me come over there," but the noise kept going. Each crunch louder, closer, then silence. The kind of silence where you feel like the whole world's holding its breath. Out of nowhere, a man just walked right into my camp as if he belonged there. No warning, no hello, just there he was. Tall, wiry, with a face that looked like it had been whittled out of driftwood. He wore an old military jacket, camo pants, and heavy black boots caked in dried mud. His hair hung down like dirty straw, and there was something off about him. The way he stood too still, staring right at me with this dead expression, like he'd seen the worst things imaginable and carried them with him. "Got any spare firewood?" he asked, his voice low and scratchy, barely above a whisper. I don't know why, but my instinct was to play it cool. I told him, "Sure, there's some by the fire," and gestured to a small pile next to my cooler. He just stared at me, unsmiling, before he picked up a few pieces and stacked them onto my fire like he owned it. Then he sat down across from me, close enough that I could see the dirt under his nails. "Nice spot you got here," he said, still not looking away. "Yeah," I mumbled, trying to keep things light. "Good place to get some peace and quiet. Not many folks around." "Peace is what people say they're after until they find it," he replied, poking the fire with a stick. I laughed awkwardly, wondering what he was on about. He just sat there, still, like he was waiting for something. After a few more minutes of awkward silence, I tried to steer the conversation back to normal, asking if he was camping nearby. He didn't answer immediately, just stared at the flames as if he hadn't heard me. Finally, he looked up, fixing me with this unnervingly blank look. "I don't camp," he said, his voice steady, cold. "I'm just passing through, following an old path." It was at that point I started feeling like I might have made a mistake coming up here alone. This guy, whoever he was, didn't seem like someone who'd gotten lost on a weekend getaway. He felt intentional, the way he just sat there, his words dripping out slow, his gaze dark and unblinking. I cleared my throat, trying to break the spell. "Well, I'm heading out tomorrow anyway. Got to get back to civilization, right?" I said, forcing a laugh. The man didn't blink. "You sure about that?" Now here's the thing. I was getting uncomfortable, but I didn't want to look like I was afraid of him, especially when we were miles from anyone who'd hear me if I yelled. Instead, I tried to play it off, leaning back in my chair and cracking another cheap joke about Bigfoot. But the man didn't laugh. He just kept staring at me, his gaze sharpening, as if he was sizing me up. Then he asked, "You ever feel like something's watching you out here?" "Not really," I lied, though by now my skin was crawling. I shrugged and took a long sip from my bottle, hoping he'd take the hint and move along. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "They come out at night, you know. The quiet ones. The ones who don't belong anywhere else. You don't see them, but they see you. They know when you're alone." I tried to keep my face neutral, though inside, every instinct I had was screaming at me to get away. But what was I going to do? Just get up and walk into the trees with him, sitting right there? So I sat there, trapped, my mind racing, waiting for him to give up and go. Eventually, he stood up, and I felt this rush of relief, until he looked down at me and said, "Careful. Not everything that goes into the woods comes back out." With that, he turned and walked off, disappearing down the path toward the valley. For a few minutes, I just sat there, feeling a strange mix of relief and disbelief. I kept telling myself that he was just some weirdo, that I'd laugh about it later. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every sound, every whisper of leaves, felt like it had a purpose, like it was waiting for me to let my guard down. Sometime around midnight, I heard the noise again, louder this time. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and scanned the area. Nothing but shadows. I almost convinced myself it was all in my head until I caught a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye, someone ducking behind a tree. I yelled out, "Who's there?" hoping I sounded more intimidating than I felt. No answer. I shone the flashlight in the direction where I'd seen the movement. And that's when I saw it. A small pile of sticks arranged in a circle right by the edge of my campsite, like some kind of makeshift trap or marker. And right in the center was my old pocket knife, one I'd left back in the RV. I didn't waste another second. I spun around, scrambling back to the RV as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, and I barely managed to get the door shut before I heard footsteps crunching outside. Inside, I locked everything I could, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I peered out through one of the windows just in time to see him standing there in the beam of my flashlight I dropped. He didn't even look angry, just determined. Without taking his eyes off the RV, he reached down, picked up my flashlight, and flicked it off, plunging everything into darkness. My whole body froze. I didn't know what to do, so I just waited, every nerve on edge, listening for any sound, any clue. Then, like some horror movie cliché, I heard the slow scrape of metal along the side of the RV. I don't know if it was a knife, a piece of wire, or something worse, but he dragged it slowly, deliberately, making sure I knew he was still there, waiting. I gripped my phone, fingers shaking as I tried to dial 911, but there was no signal out here. Nothing. Hours passed like that. Every now and then he'd make another sound, tapping on the window, scraping along the wall, or whispering something I couldn't quite make out, just loud enough to keep me alert, just quiet enough to keep me guessing. Then, as dawn started to break, I finally worked up the courage to peek outside. He was gone, or at least I thought he was. The campsite was dead quiet, like he'd never been there at all. But the ground around my RV was littered with sticks, broken branches, and strange little symbols carved into the dirt right by my door. He'd left a note, scrawled on a scrap of bark, a final parting gift. The note was simple. Not everything that goes into the woods comes back out. Remember that. I didn't waste any more time. I threw everything I could grab into the RV, fired up the engine, and got out of there without looking back. My name's Bobby Stevens, and back in 2020, I decided to try out RV camping up in the mountains near Alberta. I thought a weekend out in nature would be a nice break from my job and finances. At least, that's what I told my buddies. Truth is, I'd been through a rough breakup, and figured a solo trip might give me a little time to clear my head. Nothing like a bit of forced solitude and fresh air to knock some sense back into you, right? It was late Friday afternoon when I pulled into the campground, which was practically empty. That wasn't a huge shocker. The weather forecast was iffy, and the ranger at the entrance mentioned a bear had been spotted in the area a few days ago. But I'd already reserved the spot and I'd come prepared. Not for a bear exactly, but, standard camping stuff. I had a flashlight, my trusty old pocket knife, and enough granola bars to feed an army. My campsite was tucked away from the main loop, closer to a dense line of pines, which was part of the appeal. I parked, set up my little camp chair outside the RV, and poured a stiff drink. Sitting back, I watched the sun start to dip, the orange glow stretching over the peaks. It was peaceful, sure, but something felt off. Maybe it was the total quiet or the wind kicking up from the trees, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling gnawing at me. I laughed it off as nerves. I settled in for the night, making a basic dinner on the little portable stove and washing it down with a cold beer. Just as I finished, I heard it. A crunching sound, like something heavy stepping on twigs and leaves. The wind had died down, so the sound was clear, almost too clear. I froze, my heart picking up a beat. After a few seconds, I convinced myself it was an animal passing by, maybe even the bear the ranger mentioned. I wasn't stupid enough to go investigate, so I shut off the lights, climbed into bed, and pulled the covers up, hoping it would all be over by morning. But it wasn't. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, this time closer. They were unmistakably human, slow, deliberate, and way too close for comfort. I rolled over, squinting out the tiny RV window. The fire had died down, and everything was swallowed in darkness. I reached for my flashlight and shone it out the window, sweeping it across the campsite. Nothing. The footsteps stopped, and I took a deep breath, thinking I was imagining things. But just as I began to relax, I heard a voice, low, muttering like someone talking to themselves just outside. I strained to hear, but the words were garbled, incoherent, and unsettlingly close. My hand gripped the flashlight harder, my knuckles white. For a second, I considered calling for help, but who would hear me way out here? After what felt like an eternity, the voice faded, and the footsteps moved away. I lay in bed, wide-eyed and tense, waiting for any hint that the person might come back. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I stepped out of the RV, stretching in the crisp air, trying to shake off the uneasy night. I laughed it off again, figuring maybe someone had gotten lost or wandered too close. But when I walked around the campsite, I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the dirt, circling my RV. Not just any footprints. Barefoot, large, the kind that seemed more fitting in a horror movie than real life. The logical part of my brain told me to pack up and get the hell out of there, but the stubborn side, the part that wasn't ready to admit fear, told me to brush it off. So I did. I spent the day hiking around the area, trying to keep my mind off the strange encounter. By the time I got back, I felt calm, reassured that last night was just a weird fluke. I built a fire, ate dinner, and settled in again, determined to enjoy the solitude. But that night, things took a darker turn. It was around 1 in the morning when I heard it. A soft scratching at the side of the RV. Not a strong, confident knock, but a faint, testing scrape, like someone dragging their fingers along the metal. I sat up, heart pounding, my mind racing with explanations, each one worse than the last. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window, but the darkness outside was a wall I couldn't see past. Suddenly, the scratching stopped, replaced by a light tapping, rhythmic and maddening. Tap, tap. I had no clue what to do. I was miles from the nearest town with no cell service and not a soul around. Calling for help was pointless, so I did the only thing that seemed remotely sane. I stayed completely silent, hoping it would go away. The tapping continued for what felt like hours. I sat in the darkness, teeth clenched, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Finally, just as my nerves were about to break, the sound stopped, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. That's when I heard the voice again. It was clearer this time, just outside the window. "Are you alone?" My stomach dropped. The voice was deep, gravelly, and unsettlingly calm. I felt a wave of panic flood over me, but I forced myself to stay still, breathing as shallowly as I could. I didn't answer, praying he'd think I wasn't there. A long silence followed. Then, just as I thought he'd left, the voice came again, this time softer, more menacing. "I saw you." I fought the urge to scream, clamping a hand over my mouth to stifle any sound. My heart hammered in my chest as I sat frozen in terror. I could hear him moving around the RV, slow, purposeful steps that circled the vehicle, each one sending a chill down my spine. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, until the first light of dawn began creeping in. Only then did I muster the courage to peek out the window. The campsite was empty. No sign of anyone. But as I stepped out of the RV, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, scrawled on the side of the RV in dirt and dried mud, were 3 words: "I'm still here." I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet as I scrambled to grab my things. I wasn't staying another night. Hell, I wasn't staying another minute. I threw my stuff into the RV, turned the ignition, and tore out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind me as I drove down the narrow, winding road back to the main highway. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still following me, watching from the shadows of the trees. The rational part of my brain told me it was all in my head, that I was safe now. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. As I sped down the mountain road, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of the morning light. The towering pines seemed to lean in, casting shadows that twisted and warped in my rearview mirror. I gripped the wheel tighter, urging myself to focus on getting back to civilization, to people, to safety. About 30 minutes later, I finally hit the main road, relief flooding over me as I saw other cars in the distance. A part of me wanted to laugh at how ridiculous the whole thing seemed. Some strange man in the woods, creepy noises, cryptic words scrawled on my RV. It all sounded like something you'd tell around a campfire to scare kids. But I couldn't brush it off. The fear still clung to me, heavy and real. Once I got to the nearest town, I pulled into a gas station. The bright fluorescent lights were a welcome change from the dark isolation of the mountains. As I stepped out, I noticed dried mud smeared along the side of the RV, right over where the words had been scrawled. A mix of dread and morbid curiosity pulled me over to take a closer look. To my horror, the message had changed. The words were no longer there, but new ones had replaced them, scratched in what looked like smeared ash. "You're never alone." My blood turned to ice. I glanced around the parking lot, half expecting to see someone watching from behind one of the gas pumps, but there was no one, just a few sleepy travelers, a cashier inside yawning and scrolling on her phone, blissfully unaware of the nightmare etched into my RV. For a second, I thought about going to the police, telling them everything. But what could I say? That I'd heard weird noises and saw some writing in the dirt? I'd sound crazy, and the words, unsettling as they were, weren't exactly a crime. I could almost hear the laughter if I tried to file a report. Instead, I filled up the tank, bought a coffee, and got back in the driver's seat, determined to get as far away from those woods as possible. I drove through the day, stopping only when I absolutely had to, my eyes darting to the side mirrors every few minutes, half expecting to catch a glimpse of a figure standing by the road, following me, waiting. Finally, late that night, I made it back to my apartment. I parked the RV on the street, my muscles stiff from hours of tension. I climbed out, feeling that strange sensation again, the one that made my skin prickle, like I was being watched. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to exhaustion, and headed inside. As I locked the door behind me, I took a deep breath, letting the familiar sounds of the city settle my nerves. I thought it was over. I wanted to believe it was over. But when I walked into my bedroom, I stopped cold. On my pillow, right in the middle of the neatly made bed, was a piece of dirt-caked paper. My hands shook as I reached out, picking it up and unfolding it slowly. Scrawled in the same smudged, muddy writing were the words, "I told you, you're never alone." I dropped the note, my heart hammering, a chill spreading through my chest. There was no one else here. I'd locked the door, checked every window, even double-checked the locks on my RV before leaving it parked outside. It didn't make sense, but sense didn't matter. The reality hit me. Whoever he wasn't just some creepy stranger in the woods. He was here. He'd followed me, and there was no escaping him. The next day, I sold the RV, not caring about the hit to my wallet. I moved across the country, even changed my name, desperate to leave that nightmare behind. But every so often, I find a note slipped under my door or a muddy smudge on my car's window with those same haunting words, reminding me that he's still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to remind me that I'm never truly alone. There are easier ways to get mauled to death than being a park ranger, but none is poetic, right? It was 1998. I'd been on the job for 9 years at the Mount Baker Wilderness in Washington, working mainly to avoid staring at the walls of my one-bedroom apartment in Bellingham. My mother said I had a knack for picking careers that would either kill me or make me miserable, sometimes both, depending on the day. I didn't come into this job thinking it'd be all about wildlife conservation and peaceful mountain views. It was more about trying to distract myself from the fact that I wasn't the kind of guy who could sit at a desk and push papers around. I liked the outdoors, and I thought, why not turn that into a paycheck? But this wasn't about me wanting to save the world. It was about surviving. And I'm not talking about the bears or mountain lions. I'm talking about the quiet nights when your own thoughts creep in like an unwelcome guest. It started as a pretty standard morning. I was patrolling the western edge of the park near Mount Shuksan, checking out a report of illegal camping from some out-of-state hunters. It's the kind of thing that usually ends with me asking folks to pack up their gear and get lost, maybe issuing a fine if they give me too much attitude. But by the time I got to the spot, it was obvious nobody had been camping. The place looked trashed. Food wrappers, broken bottles, even a half-buried jacket. It was like they'd left in a hurry. The thing that got me was the smell. It was subtle at first, like a roadkill deer baking in the sun for too long. But as I got closer to the clearing, it hit me full force. My stomach did a little backflip, and I had to steady myself against a tree. I thought maybe a bear had dragged something out here, but it didn't smell right for that. Bears leave a more metallic, almost clean smell if they've gotten to something fresh. This was different. Rancid, like something that had been sitting for days, rotting with no one to care. I radioed into headquarters, telling them I might have found a poaching site or something worse, and I'd take a closer look. Standard procedure, right? Even then, I had a knot in my gut telling me to get the hell out. But you don't quit the job because of a bad feeling, especially when bad feelings are part of the job. The first body wasn't too far from where I stood. At first I thought it was just a heap of old clothes, but when I got closer I could see the outline of a leg sticking out from under the pile. My brain did its best to rationalize it. It was a dummy or someone passed out drunk. But no, this was real. It was a man, face down, his arms bent at weird angles like he'd tried to fight off whatever had attacked him. I didn't need to flip him over to know he was dead, but I did. Part of me regrets that. His face, or what was left of it, looked like it had been peeled back by something that didn't care to finish the job. His chest was torn open, ribs visible, like a predator had feasted, but not any predator I'd ever seen. Not clean, like a mountain lion. This was messy, violent, unrestrained. A kill for the sake of it, not for hunger. The second body was a few feet away, hidden under the remains of what looked like a sleeping bag. This one was a woman, or what was left of one. Her limbs had been taken. That's the only word for it. Torn off at the joints, and not in a way that a bear or a wolf would do it. It was like someone or something had wrenched them off, leaving nothing but ragged stumps. The blood had dried into the dirt around her. And there were tracks, large, deep impressions in the ground, that led off into the forest. I don't know what made me follow them. Call it stupidity, call it curiosity, maybe a bit of both. I didn't grab my rifle from the truck because in my mind there was no animal big enough in these woods to warrant it. That turned out to be my first mistake of the day. The tracks led deeper into the woods, through underbrush that had been torn apart like something huge had barreled through the trees. Too massive. Firs had deep gouges in them, like something had raked them with claws the size of my forearm. I kept going, the smell of death growing stronger. Then I heard something, a low, guttural noise, not quite a growl. More like a rumble of displeasure, like something big was annoyed I was there. In front of me, maybe 50 yards off, was a cave, barely noticeable if you weren't looking for it. I don't know why I didn't turn back then. Maybe it was the sound of a third body groaning from inside the cave. Someone was alive. At least that's what I told myself. I inched closer, heart thudding, and that's when I saw it. It came out of the cave, stooping to fit its massive frame under the low ceiling. At first glance, I thought it was a bear, but that was just my brain scrambling for something familiar to latch onto. This wasn't a bear. It was wrong. Too long, too lean, and its face wasn't right. It had the basic structure of something mammalian, but its jaws were extended, its teeth, well, Too many of them and too sharp. A nightmare of mismatched parts, as if evolution had taken a wrong turn somewhere. It saw me, and for a second, we just stared at each other. I remember thinking about how bad my breath smelled and what a terrible last thought that would be. Then it moved fast. Before I even had a chance to think, it was charging at me. I'm not proud of it, but I ran. I didn't even reach for my sidearm because I knew it wouldn't matter. This thing wasn't something you killed with a couple of shots. I don't remember much of the sprint back, just trees blurring by and the sound of branches breaking behind me. That thing was fast. Too fast for something that size. I hit the truck, flung myself into the driver's seat, and gunned it. The drive back to the station felt like a fever dream. My mind was racing, adrenaline pumping so hard I could barely feel my hands on the wheel. I should have gone back for the bodies, but all I could think about was getting the hell out of there. When I reached the station, I burst in like a madman, rambling about what I'd seen. No one believed me, of course. It's not like you can walk into a ranger station and start babbling about some unknown creature without getting a few sideways looks. They sent out a search team the next day. I wasn't part of it, thank God. But when they came back, they had no bodies, no sign of anything strange, just the remains of a campsite that looked like a bunch of bears had trashed it. Of course, that's the story they told the press. The hikers, missing, vanished into thin air. I left that job a year later. Maybe it was cowardice, maybe it was just self-preservation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been marked by that thing. Like it had let me go, but only because it was toying with me. I moved to the city, got an office job, and started living like a regular person. But sometimes when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear that rumble again, and I wonder if it's out there, waiting for me to come back. My name's Randy Smith, and back in 2019, I took my trusty old RV up to the quiet stretches of Moosehead Lake in Maine. I'm the kind of guy who thinks that the best kind of alarm clock is the sun peeking through the trees. Though I still pack instant coffee, because roughing it shouldn't mean suffering. I had been working non-stop for months, and the idea of escaping into nature sounded like the perfect remedy. My friends joked that I'd last a day without Wi-Fi, but I was determined to prove them wrong. The open road was calling, and who was I to decline? The drive was smooth, with the kind of scenery that makes you forget about emails and deadlines. Pine trees lined the roads, and the air smelled cleaner with every mile I covered. When I finally reached Moosehead Lake, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the water. It was picturesque, like a postcard you'd send just to make people jealous. I found a secluded spot by the lake to park my RV. There were a few other campers scattered around, but everyone seemed to keep to themselves. After settling in, I decided to stretch my legs and take a walk along the shoreline. The water was so clear you could see the pebbles at the bottom, and the gentle lapping of the waves was the kind of white noise that could put you to sleep. As I walked, I noticed an old man fishing off a small pier. He wore a weathered hat and had a beard that would make Santa Claus envious. I gave him a nod. "Any luck today?" I asked. He looked up, his eyes squinting against the fading light. "Plenty of fish in this lake," he replied, "but sometimes it's not about the catch." I chuckled. "Sounds like something a guy who hasn't caught anything would say." He grinned. "Fair enough, but out here it's the peace that counts." We chatted for a bit. His name was Walter, a local who had been fishing these waters for decades. He told me about the best spots to watch the sunrise and where to find trails that weren't on any map. There was something comforting about his presence, like talking to an old friend you hadn't seen in years. As the night crept in, I headed back to my RV. I cooked up some canned chili, not exactly gourmet, but it did the job. Settling into my camp chair, I watched as the stars began to dot the sky. Without the glare of city lights, they seemed so much brighter. almost close enough to touch. Just as I was considering turning in for the night, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby, probably a raccoon or some other critter looking for scraps. I made a mental note to secure the trash before heading to bed. The next morning I woke up early, determined to catch the sunrise Walter had mentioned. Armed with a thermos of coffee, I made my way to the spot, a small clearing overlooking the lake. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, the kind of beauty that makes waking up at dawn worthwhile. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed something floating near the shore. It looked like a bundle of clothes caught on a branch. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked down to take a closer look. As I approached, my stomach tightened. It wasn't clothes. It was a backpack. I pulled it from the water and set it on the ground. It was soaked, but I could make out a name tag, Emily. Inside, there was a wallet, some granola bars, and a map of the area. No phone, though. Maybe someone lost it while canoeing, I thought. I decided to take it back to the main campsite later, figuring someone might be looking for it. On my way back, I ran into Walter again. "Morning," I called out. "Found someone's backpack in the lake. Know anyone named Emily?" His face grew serious. "Emily? Can't say I do. Might belong to one of the hikers." "Planning to drop it off at the ranger station?" I said. "Good idea," he replied, but there was a hint of concern in his voice. The rest of the day was uneventful. I hiked one of the trails Walter had recommended and took some photos that would surely make my friends back home jealous. By the time I returned, the sun was beginning to dip again. Back at the campsite, there was a bit of a commotion. A couple of park rangers were talking to campers, showing them a photo. When they reached me, one of them asked, "Excuse me, sir, have you seen this woman?" He held out a picture of a young woman with curly brown hair and a bright smile. Underneath the name, Emily Parker, was printed. My heart skipped a beat. "I haven't seen her, but I found this backpack near the lake this morning," I said, handing it over. The rangers exchanged glances. "Where exactly did you find this?" I pointed in the direction of the clearing right by the shore, caught on a branch. They thanked me and moved on. A missing person wasn't exactly the kind of excitement I was looking for on this trip. That evening, as I was grilling some sausages, Walter wandered over. "Heard about the girl," he said. "Yeah, it's unsettling," I replied. "Makes you realize how vast this place is." He nodded slowly. "These woods have a way of swallowing people up. Gotta be careful." There was an awkward silence. To lighten the mood, I said, "Well, if I get lost, at least I've got enough canned chili to survive for a week." Walter gave a half smile. "Just don't wander too far off the trails." As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the missing girl, or perhaps the way Walter seemed uneasy. I decided to turn in early. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang on the side of my RV. My first thought was that a tree branch had fallen. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously stepped outside. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I scanned the area but saw nothing unusual. Just as I was about to head back in, I heard muffled voices coming from deeper in the woods. I hauled out. "Is someone there?" No response. Probably other campers, I told myself, but at this hour I decided to investigate, partly out of concern, partly because my curiosity always got the better of me, a trait that had landed me in hot water more than once. I followed the sound of the voices, which grew clearer but remained indistinct. They seemed to be coming from an old trail that veered away from the main paths. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, and the canopy above blocked out most of the moonlight. I was relying entirely on my flashlight now. "Maybe this isn't the best idea," I muttered. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a sharp cry, a woman's voice. "Hello, are you okay?" I shouted, picking up my pace. The underbrush was thick, and I stumbled several times. The beam of my flashlight danced erratically, casting long shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I broke into a small clearing and froze. There was a cabin I hadn't seen before. Its wooden walls were aged and covered in moss. A faint light flickered from inside. Approaching cautiously, I peered through a grimy window. What I saw made my blood run cold. Inside, a man was pacing back and forth. He was tall, with unkempt hair and a scraggly beard. On a table beside him were various knives and tools laid out meticulously. But what caught my attention was the figure tied to a chair, Emily. Her head was slumped forward and her arms were bound behind her. She looked battered but alive. I had to act, but charging in wasn't an option. I reached into my pocket for my phone, but of course there was no signal out here. I needed a plan. Retreating a few steps, I tried to think. Maybe I could create a distraction or find something to use as a weapon. Just then, I stepped on a twig, and the snap echoed louder than a gunshot in the silence. The door of the cabin swung open. The man stepped out, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" he barked. I ducked behind a tree, holding my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. He took a few steps forward, holding a hatchet in his hand. "I know someone's out there," he growled. I needed to lead him away from the cabin. Picking up a stone, I tossed it into the bushes off to my right. It rustled loudly. He snapped his head toward the sound and started moving in that direction. Seizing the opportunity, I crept around the other side of the cabin, entering quietly. I approached Emily. Up close, I could see bruises on her face. Her eyes fluttered open as I touched her shoulder. "Shh, I'm here to help," I whispered, starting to untie her hands. She nodded weakly. "He'll be back any second," she murmured. "Not if I can help it." Just as I loosened the ropes, I heard footsteps approaching. "Change of plans," I said, helping her to her feet. "We need to hide." We slipped behind a tattered curtain just as the door swung open. The man stormed in, clearly agitated. "I know someone's been snooping around," he spat. He moved toward the chair, noticing the ropes were undone. "Clever girl," he hissed. Holding my breath, I gripped a rusty pipe I had found leaning against the wall. Emily was trembling beside me. The man started tearing the place apart, overturning furniture and kicking open cabinets. "You can't hide forever," he shouted, as he moved closer to our hiding spot. I knew we had to make a move. I tightened my grip on the pipe. Just as he yanked the curtain aside, I swung with all my might. The pipe connected with his shoulder, and he staggered back with a grunt. "Run," I yelled to Emily. We bolted out the door, sprinting into the darkness. Behind us, I could hear him recovering, his footsteps thundering as he gave chase. The woods were a maze, but adrenaline fueled our escape. Branches whipped against my face, and the uneven ground threatened to trip us at every turn. "There's a road up ahead," Emily panted. "Keep going." A sudden sharp pain shot through my leg as I stumbled over a root. I hit the ground hard. Emily stopped to help me up. "No time," I gasped. "You keep running." She shook her head. "Not a chance." We could hear him crashing through the underbrush, getting closer. Desperate, I looked around and spotted a fallen tree limb, a hefty one. "Help me lift this," I said. Together, we propped it up at an angle between two trees, creating a makeshift trap. "Hide," I told her. We crouched behind a thicket just as he burst into the small clearing. He paused, listening. Come out, wherever you are," he taunted as he stepped forward. His foot caught under the raised limb. With a heave, I pushed it down, causing him to trip and fall hard onto the ground. The hatchet flew from his hand. Seizing the moment, I grabbed the hatchet. He rolled over, eyes wide, as he realized I was now armed. "Stay back," I warned, though my hands were shaking. He sneered. "You don't have it in you." He lunged at me, and instinct took over. I swung the hatchet, not aiming, just reacting. It connected with his arm, and he howled in pain. "Let's go," Emily screamed. We ran again, the sounds of his curses fading as we put distance between us. After what felt like hours, we broke through the tree line onto a gravel road. Headlights appeared in the distance. A ranger vehicle. We flagged them down frantically. The ranger, a middle-aged woman named Officer Reynolds, stepped out. "What happened?" she asked, eyeing our disheveled appearance. "There's a man. He's back there. He took her," I said, pointing into the woods. Emily nodded. "He's dangerous. We need help." Reynolds radioed for backup and ushered us into the vehicle. As we drove back toward the main station, more patrol cars sped past us toward the area. At the station, they took our statements. Emily told them how she had been hiking when the man attacked her, dragging her to the cabin. She'd been there for 2 days. "Do you know who he is?" I asked one of the officers. They exchanged glances. "We've had reports of a drifter matching that description," one said. "Name's Victor Strand, wanted in connection with several assaults up north." "Well, he's more than a drifter," I replied. "He's a psychopath." They assured us they would do everything to apprehend him. Emily was taken to a hospital for evaluation, and they offered me a place to rest for the night. The next morning, Officer Reynolds informed me that they had found the cabin, but no sign of Victor. "We did find evidence linking him to other missing persons cases," she said grimly. "So he's still out there," I murmured. She nodded. "But we're on high alert now. He won't get far." I decided it was time to cut my trip short. As much as I loved the serenity of nature, I figured I'd had enough excitement to last me a lifetime. As I was packing up my RV, Walter appeared one last time. "Heard about what happened," he said. "News travels fast around here," I replied. He looked out toward the lake. "Be careful out there. The world isn't as peaceful as we'd like to think." I gave a small smile. "You can say that again." With everything loaded, I took one last look at Moosehead Lake. It was still as beautiful as when I arrived, but now it held a darkness I couldn't quite shake. Climbing into the driver's seat, I started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I couldn't help but think about Victor Strand. Where he came from, what led him down such a dark path. But that was a story for someone else to uncover. My name is Lawrence Mosby, and this went down back in 2020 up in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, just south of the Tennessee border. I thought a solo trip would be a chance to clear my head. Just me and my RV out in the middle of nowhere, away from spreadsheets, conference calls, and city noise. I'd always been a bit of a weekend warrior, used to little hikes here and there, but this time I was determined to go all in and actually live in the park for a week. I'd parked my RV at the Elkmont Campground, which has this mix of historic cabins and scattered RV sites nestled under thick trees, quiet except for the usual wildlife sounds. A ranger passed by my campsite when I first arrived, casually warning me that the season had seen an unusual amount of activity, his words vague enough to mean anything. He probably caught the blank look on my face because he added, "Just be careful around the trails, okay?" before disappearing back up the path. A couple of days in, and I'd slipped into the rhythm of park life. Early morning hikes, lazy afternoons by the fire, and long nights under the stars. It was exactly what I needed. I even made friends with a couple parked a few sites down, Sam and Ellie, who'd been RVing around the country for the past 6 months. They had this casual charm about them, like they'd lived a dozen lives already and didn't care who knew it. One night, after a particularly good meal and a beer by the fire, Sam suggested we take a quick walk up an old ranger trail he'd heard about. I could see the idea spark something in him. Maybe the kind of thrill-seeking spirit only a guy who's driven through backcountry roads his whole life would think was a good idea. Against my better judgment, and Ellie's eye roll, I shrugged and said I'd tag along. We grabbed a flashlight, leaving Ellie behind, who muttered something about wanting to stay back with her book. Sam and I headed up our path, dimly lit by my flashlight and the weak light of his phone. The ranger trail was overgrown with thick underbrush on either side. the air thick with that distinct smell of damp wood and soil. The silence felt weighty, but I pushed the thought aside, blaming the unease on city boy jitters. As we hiked up, the forest closed in, tree trunks looming like silent giants, their tangled branches forming odd shadowy shapes in the weak glow. Every so often, Sam would make a half-edged joke to lighten the mood, something about how he could already imagine Ellie reading his eulogy if we got lost. I'd laugh, but it was strained. Something about the air felt wrong. The forest felt too still, like it was holding its breath. We came across something strange about a mile in. An abandoned tent, collapsed and half buried under leaves and debris. Sam poked at it with his boot, half laughing. Think someone ditched the camping life for a motel? Probably just some hiker who got spooked by a bear, I said, glancing around, but even as I said it, I felt an itch in the back of my mind, like something was off. Why would anyone leave a tent half collapsed and scattered? We kept moving, pushing deeper into the trail. After a while, Sam stopped suddenly, shining his phone on something half hidden by a pile of branches. It looked like a backpack, weathered and dirty, with a name tag Adams written in marker on one of the straps. Odd place to lose a bag, Sam said, frowning. He squatted down, flipping open the top pocket. Maps, a first aid kit, basic stuff. Looks like it's been here a while. We heard the crack of a branch behind us, sharp and loud in the quiet night. I turned, scanning with my flashlight, catching nothing but empty woods and shadows. My nerves were starting to get the better of me. I chuckled nervously, saying, "Guess the park ranger was right about all the activity." But there was no laugh from Sam this time. "Hey man," he said slowly, rising to his feet, his face tight with concern, "let's get back to camp." I didn't argue. We started back down the trail at a quicker pace, both of us keenly aware of every rustle, every snap from the dark trees around us. The flashlight beam dotted from side to side as we hurried, trying to find some sense of normalcy in the oppressive quiet. Then we heard footsteps, heavy, unhurried, matching our pace as if they were right on top of us, but somehow still hidden. I muttered, "Is that a bear?" "No bear walks like that, man," Sam replied, his voice shaking. Another crack, this time much closer, made us freeze in place. I swung the flashlight wildly, catching a flash of something. Someone standing among the trees. He was barely visible, dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by a hood pulled low. He didn't move, just stood there watching us in silence. "Let's go, let's go," Sam whispered, yanking on my sleeve. We stumbled down the trail, adrenaline surging. I dared a glance back, and he was still there, barely lit by my flashlight's dying beam, standing perfectly still, like he was carved out of the forest itself. As we neared the trailhead, the man's footsteps started again, heavy and rhythmic, closer than before. Sam was already ahead, but I stopped when I heard something different. A second set of footsteps, quick and light, like someone running. They were coming from my left, off the path. My flashlight flickered just as I caught sight of a girl darting through the trees, her face pale and streaked with dirt. She was whispering, desperate and quiet. "Help me, please." The words sent chills through me. I started toward her, calling, Hey, hold on." But she looked past me, her expression frozen in pure terror, and bolted. The heavy footsteps returned, pounding behind me. I didn't look back. I sprinted, catching up to Sam, and we burst out onto the campground, gasping for breath. Ellie was waiting, her face tight with worry. "What the hell happened? You two look like you saw a ghost." "Not a ghost," Sam muttered, his voice strained. "Just someone." Before I could explain further, we heard the faint crunch of leaves from the trail's edge. The man in the coat stepped out, standing just beyond the campground lights, his head tilted like he was considering us. He didn't speak, didn't gesture, just stared unblinking. "Hey," Sam yelled, brandishing the flashlight like a weapon. "You need to leave." The man didn't react. He just turned and walked back up the trail, disappearing into the trees. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The rest of the night passed uneasily. I hardly slept, my mind racing through every possible explanation, each more disturbing than the last. Morning finally came, and we packed up, determined to put miles between us and that place. As we left, we passed a ranger at the entrance. I mentioned what we'd seen, hoping for some logical explanation. He listened, then sighed. "You're not the first to report strange sightings up there," he said, his face grim. "There have been disappearances. People going missing without a trace. Officially, we say it's wildlife or accidents." He trailed off, his eyes darkening. But what I wanted to ask, I already knew I wouldn't get an answer that would help me sleep any better. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the image of that girl's terrified face, her desperate whispers still echoing in my ears.